Joining us now for more is William Pesek. He's a columnist and author of Japanization. William, let's start with the latest developments out of Tokyo, where you are. Prime Minister Ishiba drawing a firm line saying that we will not easily compromise. Given the looming tariff deadline and also the political pressure at home, just how much leverage does Tokyo have left, and who's more likely to blink first?
I think the bigger question is how much leverage does Trump have left? I mean, one of the things that Donald Trump probably doesn't know is that there's an election happening on Sunday, and Prime Minister Ishiba could be gone by Monday. His approval ratings are in the high 20s, the low 30s. His party is expected to eke out something of a victory on Sunday, but basically not winning a full majority. And so Prime Minister Ishiba could be shown the door within a few days, and then President Trump has to learn the name of a new Mr. Japan and needs to sit down with a brand new trade deal and really start from scratch, because the next government might have very different ideas than the current government. And I see a lot of what's happening as Trump thinking that the global economy is a big reality TV show, and the next episode is tariffs, the cliffhanger, tariffs. And I think, we're looking at August 1st, and we're thinking about the extent to which countries can basically race some kind of deal into existence to avoid bigger tariffs from the U.S. But the bigger question for me is, what's the point of all this? I mean, Trump will get some victories. Maybe he'll be able to do some ribbon cutting. He'll do some press conferences. He'll sign some documents. But will this rearrange the global trading system? Will this change the relationship in any way between the U.S. and Asia? I'm skeptical of that. And really, again, the big question is China, right? Japan, India, Indonesia, these are important economies, but it's all about China. And it's all about Trump getting China to the altar. And the question is, how is he doing on that? And the answer is not very well.
Okay, we'll get to China in a bit, but I want to ask you about Japan. I was going to ask you what's making it especially difficult for Japan, but I realized that I should reframe that, given what you've said about the art of the deal and how it's not working in Asia at this particular time on tariffs. Can you give us a sense of what's the thinking that the Japanese and also the South Koreans have as they engage in negotiations and, try to basically do away with any tariffs on their key exports, particularly, I guess, autos?
Right. Well, I think the Japanese are just frustrated. 6 years ago, the Japanese went through this process earlier, right? 6 years ago, Japan signed a free trade agreement with the U.S. Now here we are 6 years later. Trump wants another free trade agreement with Japan, and Japan is rolling his eyes saying, what are we doing here? I think one of the concerns that Japan has certainly also is that Trump misunderstands the relationship between Japan and the U.S. I've lived here more than 20 years. And I can tell you the reason why Japanese don't buy U.S. cars is because Japanese roads are tiny, U.S. cars are huge. That is the problem. That is why Japanese don't buy Fords and GMs. It has nothing to do with tariff rates, has nothing to do with non-tariff barriers. Also, Japanese believe that their cars have better quality than U.S. cars. And so Trump is acting as if he's going to change this relationship. He's going to force Japan to import millions of U.S. cars when no one's going to buy them. And that's why you see Trump focusing, and his team wisely, I think, focusing on certain areas where there could be agreement, like rice, for example. Japan's having a rice price crisis at the moment. The U.S. could certainly import more rice to Japan to help U.S. producers, but also to allay or alleviate China's pricing crisis for rice. That's an area of agreement. But I think in many ways, Japan is like, look, we did this 6 years ago. Why are we doing this again? And we might have a new prime minister in a couple of weeks. So why don't we do this in 2026? Why are we rushing to do this right now? So I think Japan is a bit frustrated. And I think the U.S. is surprised that Japan has not been more compliant, right? I think Japan thought the U.S. would be so easy. Wow, Japan will be so desperate for a deal. We'll have that big win basically in the victory column early. Japan's been a lot more difficult than the U.S. expected, and I think Trump is frustrated as well.
William, to your point about China, I mean, how heavily, this is a broader question for Asian countries who don't yet have a deal, the China transshipment component, I mean, is this something that we are going to see? Is it what Trump is expecting from countries in particular which have that China plus one component as part of their economies and local manufacturing?
Well, I mean, that is really the question, because a lot of these trade deals are being signed with China in mind. Like when the US signed a trade deal with Vietnam, we're still not really sure what that trade deal is. But when the US signed that deal, it wasn't about Vietnam, it was about China. And the whole, issue was about transshipments. And I think Vietnam signed the deal knowing full well that in Asia, given supply chains, it's very, very difficult to figure out which is a transshipment and which is not. And, basically exporters can get very creative about labeling boxes differently and essentially evading these latest US tariffs. And I think that's why Vietnam was very happy to sign a document, because they know it's really not enforceable. But you're right, this is all about China. It's all about transshipments. And I think Trump also is very frustrated by the fact that Xi Jinping has been a much more, sort of equal adversary than he ever expected on this issue. And I think that the best case scenario for Trump is that he signs some kind of trade deal with China to get the victory and say, look, I signed a trade deal with China. But it won't change the relationship significantly between the US and the Chinese. And one of the reasons is because the Chinese are ready for him, right? The Chinese lived through Trump 1.0. They saw his tactics then. They know exactly how to play this guy. And in many ways, China is ready to sign some kind of non-deal deal that doesn't change the trading relationship very much, but gets Trump to move on to other pet issues. He'll move on to India. He'll move on to Latin America. He'll move on to Africa, because he'll have a China deal in his pocket, one that doesn't change very much, but one that will get him off China's back.
Okay, William, speaking of tactics, some analysts point to a pattern where Mr. Trump backs down when confronted with economic strength as in the case of China, but escalates when countries hesitate or rely on diplomacy. Is strength or countermeasures a threat, the strategy that works with this administration?
Well, it's the strategy. I'm not sure it works. I mean, you're referring to Taco, right? The idea that Trump always chickens out. That's why Wall Street is not plunging every time Trump now talks about tariffs. When Trump recently talked about taxing Brazil, the stock market didn't collapse. When Trump talks about taxing the EU now, the stock market doesn't collapse. When Trump talks about anything to do with OPEC, the stock market doesn't collapse, because I think traders have realized that, again, Trump will always chicken out at the end of the day. And that's the bet they're making. And Trump really is afraid of the bond market. So anything that the bond market does to push back against his policies is going to work. Anytime U.S. Treasury yields rise, anytime that feeds back into the stock market, the S&P 500 has a rough day, Trump backs off. And I think, investors know that. I think countries are beginning to know that more and more. And I think for a lot of national leaders, when they sign a free trade deal with Trump, a lot of it is performative. It's just basically getting him off their back to let him move on to other issues and other victims, if you will. These are not negotiations. These are shakedowns. And, I see this painfully because I'm an American. I'm from Queens, New York, where Trump is from. So you would think I'd be more supportive of his policies. But I'm horrified of the extent to which I've been writing about Asia for 20 years. And I'm just horrified by the extent to which Trump has come here to this region with complete ignorance and acted as if it's 1985 all over again. And it's 2025. Somebody should tell him.
Right. William, looking into 2026 and beyond, I mean, the factors that you mentioned, what's being factored in, are world leaders, particularly the smaller nations, I guess, factoring in, or, I guess maybe resigned to the fact that we are facing a world where US tariffs are going to be there. I mean, Trump has talked about a baseline of 10 to 20%. And I've come across many reports, that say that's the reality. That's what it's going to be going forward.
The tariffs are one thing. The uncertainty is something else. If the world knew that the U.S. was going to set a 25% unilateral tax for all goods, that will be a problem. But it'd be better than not knowing what tariff rates will be a year from now. So if you're a business, if you're an exporter, if you're a small mom and pop shop in Jakarta, and you're trying to figure out if you can hire a couple of people in the next 6 months or fire a couple of people in the next 6 months, extrapolate this out through the region. We have billions of people in Asia sitting around wondering what gives. And I think the uncertainty is almost worse than the tariffs. I think, for Asia, this is a lost period with the U.S. I really see no avenue for Asia to work with the U.S. productively when, as I wrote in a column recently, Donald Trump to me is like the Joker in The Dark Knight, the Heath Ledger character. He's just somebody who wants to watch the world burn. And how do you do business with that guy? And I think for Asia, the uncertainty is almost worse than the tariffs themselves. Unfortunately, we have these two problems being layered on top of one another. And, I just think that for anyone in the financial industry or business industry who'd hope to take a vacation in August, good luck with that.
All right, William, we are going to have to leave it there. And with that image as well from Batman, William Pesek is columnist and author of Japanization. Thank you so much.
Thank you.